Oh, hey there, everyone. My name is Sam Stewart, and today I'd like to take you through an informal presentation on the topic of historical preservation. Now, what is historical preservation beyond the implied name? Focusing our presentation within the bounds of the United States, it is the preservation of historic buildings, landmarks, and battlefields. Now, this work started to begin after World War II and into the 1950s. To put it bluntly, the impact of redevelopment around the country led citizens to an interest in historic preservation. Now, when we see our past fading away, especially parts that contributed to our shared human story, it is by all means sensical to preserve our history for future generations, to avoid our mistakes and continue our triumphs. In 1966, the National Historic Preservation Act of the same year introduced the National Register of Historic Places, which lists districts, sites, buildings, structures, and objects significant to American history shown in architecture, archaeology, engineering, and culture. Since passed, the federal government is committed by law to protect these resources. Just a few years later, the National Environmental Policy Act of 1969 became law, giving additional provisions for preserving important historic, cultural, and natural aspects of our national heritage. As you may suspect, the government agency responsible for maintaining these provisions belongs to the National Park Service. Now, behind me over here, this hill, the cemetery named Mound Hill Cemetery, legend says a group of Native Americans are buried standing straight up, and there are many Indian burial mounds around Preble County. Remember back to President Eisenhower's push to build highways throughout our country? It was this very act that motivated citizens to form private preservation groups and employ their representatives to pass the Transportation Act of 1966 to address the unhinged expansion of progress that saw the loss of historic sites to fast travel. Once in place, the Transportation Act now required the Secretary of Transportation to deny any new building projects involving historical sites outside drastic measures. We're here at historic Roberts Bridge, the oldest covered bridge in the state of Ohio. Now, if you want to preserve a historic location in your state or county, you will need a comprehensive plan. Many different aspects are involved in making a solid plan. From the involvement of transportation, economic development, and environmental planning. All of these must be in relation to each other, ensuring a community of unity. Now, the Department of Transportation is required by this policy to make special effort to preserve and enhance the natural beauty of the land crossed via the transportation lines. These transportation provisions have likely been used to protect historic sites in your own town. Such has been done here in our town, dedicated to Roberts Bridge here. I'm standing here at the Preble County Courthouse. Now, this is not the original building, which was built back in the early 1800s, but it has been rebuilt in the style and architecture of the community. Now, if you have a location that you would like to preserve, it's important to know how to categorize it as part of the planning process. It's important to know whether you are dealing with a historic area or a cultural one. Land with structures and objects that have local, state, or national significance are historical areas, while areas categorized by evidence of ethnic, religious, or social groups with distinct traits, beliefs, and social reforms, those are cultural areas. Local comprehensive plans and land use regulations are required by statute to comply with these goals. Additionally, Tax Reform Act of 1976, along with the Economic Recovery Tax Act of 1981, encourage historic preservation by way of tax deduction for rehabilitation. Why save and preserve an old building? We are standing here outside the oldest church in Preble County, Ohio, historic Hopewell. As far as historic preservation goes, this building was built in 1826 on top of the original log foundation, which was built in 1808. Now, why did the citizens in this area find the preservation of this church significant enough to place it on the National Register of Historic Places? Some plausible explanations include the building's architecture and materials. If it was to be torn down, what would be lost? It soon would be forgotten, and future residents would lose the history of their county. This old church is a reminder of the region's culture and heritage. Still today, this church is used for worship by a multitude of believers from around the county, remembering and experiencing the history of the Scots-Irish Presbyterians that once sang hymns within these walls just 200 years ago. Welcome to the Old Frontier. We are standing at the site of a minor battle of the Northwest Indian Wars, fought in 1792, between Chief Little Turtle of the Indian Confederacy and Brigadier General John Adair. Nearly 2-to-1 odds against Adair, and yet the skirmish ended as it had began. Adair losing 6 men and many horses. Now, why is this site worth preserving? Along with the designated area of Old Fort St. Clair. Battlefield locations are primary sources that tell our story. Gruesome or not, does not deny its significance. It was the year of the horse, 1990, if you hadn't been to a Chinese buffet recently. And the Secretary of the Interior established the American Battlefield Protection Program, specifically to protect Civil War battlefields, set in place to provide technical and financial resources to state and local governments and other preservation organizations. Now, if preservation work was going to take place, the American Battlefield Protection Program looks at 4 distinct components. The first component is the core area, the area where the most heavy battle took place. Now, the second is the study area, involving troop movements, a hospital, or even a fort, such as the St. Clair's Fort here. Now, the third component is the significant view sheds, meaning unblemished vistas leading towards the core area. And the fourth is the buffer zones. These are to include the surrounding land that helps to protect and give life to the whole experience of the battlefield. Historical research, above ground resource identification, the establishment of boundaries, the current land use, and ownership are all part of the evaluation process in working to have a battlefield preserved. Now, this site right here are the 6 men during the battle with Chief Little Turtle that General Adair lost. And this oak tree we call here the Whispering Oak, and it was here during the battle and bared witness to the fight. Now, what may be the purpose of all this work? Once recorded in the National Register of Historic Places, the site is then protected from state and federal expansion projects that could destroy our history. This also helps local citizens to realize their stewardship of the site. Now, I'd like to thank you all for your attention and interest in historical preservation. Take care now.